Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to use the Tai Chi technique of grasp the sparrow's tail to help you better understand how to create hip power and how that hip power interacts with the rotation of our waist. We're going to explore several aspects of how to use the hips. First of all, you're going to notice that we're powering with one hip or the other, not both at the same time. Beginning as I go into ward off, we're powering with the left hip through this series of motions. And then now I'm powering with the right hip through this series of motions. And then now I'm powering with the left hip. And then now the right hip, and now the left hip. One of the things you should appreciate there is that the body is generally moving away from the hip that is creating the power. I move away from the left hip as I do ward off, and then I keep turning away, and then I use the right hip to power during rollback. And I continue powering with the right hip during the transition to press, and now I'm using the left hip. And then now I'm going to push back and down with the right hip, and then push forward with the left hip. So I'm not using both hips at the same time because the hips are one of the parts of the core that create rotation. And to create rotation, I need to be able to move around a single axis of my spine. And that requires force on one side, not the other, or I would be creating force against force. So I have to move left, right, left, right. And I'm always moving away from the hip that is powering. The only exception is if I'm standing up using the hip, let's say from this position, and I stand up, I'm using my left hip to power to stand up. But in this sense, I am moving away from the left hip because I'm rising away from the left foot. But if I have both feet on the ground, I'm going to be moving away from the hip that is creating the power. The next thing we need to understand is what part of the hip we're using to create the power. We can use hip flexion from the muscles in the front of the hip and the core, or we can use hip extension from the muscles in the back, the glutes. When we're doing Tai Chi or any walking on 2 feet, we're using one or the other, hip extension or hip flexion. Here I'm using hip extension. Here I'm using hip flexion. I'm continuing to use hip flexion. I'm still using hip flexion. Now I'm using hip extension. Now I'm using hip extension, and I'm again using hip extension. So what you can see there is whether we're using hip extension or flexion doesn't determine whether we are moving forward or backward. In ward off, I'm using hip extension to shift forward. In press, I'm using hip flexion to move forward. And rollback, I'm using hip flexion to move backward. But in the beginning of push, when I push back and down, I'm using hip extension to move backward. So backward and forward don't equate to flexion versus extension. To better understand hip flexion versus hip extension, we have to look at first, what does that definition mean? Hip extension is when the leg and the pelvis increase in the angle relative to the front of the pelvic bone. So as I extend the hip, the angle between my pelvis and my hip is increasing. When I flex the hip, the angle between the leg and the pelvis is decreasing. But that doesn't mean that we're going forward or backward necessarily, because it's not just the position of the leg, it's the position of the pelvis relative to the leg. So this is one type of hip extension where the leg is going to go back behind the vertical pelvis, creating extension. But this is also extension, the pelvis tipping backward relative to the leg. That is also hip extension. And then flexion works the same way. Flexion can be the leg coming forward, but it also flexion can be the pelvis coming forward relative to the leg. So that is also hip flexion. When we are moving, standing up on two legs, we're always coordinating the hip action with our lower ab and upper ab action. And the lower abs create posterior rotation of the pelvis. I'm going to take my lower abs on the left and tuck under. That's what they do in addition to rotation. It creates a posterior rotation of the pelvis similar to that occurs with hip extension. So I can create that posterior rotation of the pelvis either with the glutes or with the lower abs or both. So when I do this motion of press, which looks like hip extension, it's not. It's actually leg extension, but not hip extension. I'm using hip flexion. The hip is pulling down on the pelvis here from these front muscles. And at the same time, I'm using the lower abs to tuck the pelvis. And so the combination of the forward tilt of the pelvis from the hip and then the posterior tilt of the pelvis from the lower abs gets me to this position. So I went from this position to this position by hip flexion and rotation from the lower abs, not by using the glutes to extend. So that will clarify a bit of why we can move forward with hip flexion, not always with hip extension. Now let's look at rotation that occurs from hip extension versus hip flexion. And this is really fascinating, and it will kind of tie in what makes Tai Chi movement work. We're combining our hip power with rotation from the upper and lower waist. And the combination of rotation that we use determines the ultimate effect of the movement. So when I'm doing ward off here, I'm turning the upper and lower waist towards the extending hip. Everything is turning back towards the ground and essentially pushing off the ground in this motion. I'm pushing off from the glutes like that. I'm pushing off from the lower abs, which are turning back against the ground and also tucking the pelvis on the left. And then I'm turning the upper waist to the left, and that creates the expansion from my right arm because everything is turning and reflecting off the ground. So that is 3 yang elements in ward off. And then now I'm going to start adding some yin to the movement by turning first the lower abs, then the upper abs away from the extending hip. And then now we can see how the hip pushing creates a rotational effect away from the extending hip. When I was turning everything in the waist towards the extending hip, we couldn't appreciate the rotation because we're moving in opposite directions. The hips moving that way, the upper and lower waist are moving towards it, so it doesn't turn away. That gets me a appearance of straight motion. But now I'm going to turn the lower abs away and the upper abs away, and what we'll see is the hip extension causes the body to move away from that extending hip as I do that motion. Now we're going to have the opposite effect in rollback. When I do rollback, even though it appears that my body might be turning to the left, and a lot of people teach it that way, when I do rollback like this, I'm turning the upper and lower waist to the right, towards the flexing hip. The flexing hip is receiving that rotation, and combined together, it causes the body to retreat backward. But I'm not turning this way. I'm turning to the right, and that creates the motion. All yin, because when we flex the hip, it creates a receptive energy. So when I turn towards it, instead of being repelled away, the body is received into the flexion. The upper waist receiving into the flexion, the lower waist also being received into that flexion. That is rollback. And then just like I turned the lower waist and upper waist away from the extension when I did this, I'm now going to turn the lower waist and the upper waist away from the flexion. Here, first the lower waist turning away, and then the upper waist turning away. But you're going to see a different effect than what we saw with ward off and then turning out, because hip flexion causes the body to be pulled into that hip flexion. So even as I try to turn the lower abs away, right here, the hip flexion is pulling the body back to the right, even though the lower abs are turning to the left. And then as I turn the upper abs to the left, the hip flexion is still pulling the body back to the right. That creates the circling of the hands to the wrist, all as I'm turning the waist away from this flexing hip. So we have the flexing power pulling the body in the direction of the flexion. When we do hip extension, we have the body repelled away from the side of the hip extension. So really these motions here are mirror images, actually inverse images, all yang, and then adding some yin, and then all yin, and then adding some yang. That creates 6 of the 8 Tai Chi energies. And then now we only have 2 energies left. If we relate these to the trigrams, this was ward off, this is pluck, this is shoulder strike, this is rollback, this is split, this is elbow strike. And now the next 2 that we have remaining are press, which is here, and then we push to open the arms, we push back from the right hip, and then we push forward from the left hip. Now, many people perform that push in a different way after the press and opening the arms. People shift back like that. That is press and then push, versus this is push and push. When we do press, we're flexing the active hip. When we do push, we're extending the active hip, but the core waist rotation is the same. So as I do press, here I'm flexing my left hip, powering from the front. When I open the arms, I'm going to change that hip flexion to hip extension to open the arms. And as far as the waist rotation goes, when I do press or push, the lower abs are turning in the direction of the active hip, turning back in this sense, and the upper waist is going to turn away from the active hip. So the left upper waist is turning this way as the lower abs and the hip flex on the left side. It's different from ward off, because in ward off, the right side is rotating. In push, the left side is rotating. So that's how we can understand that. But that is press with flexion of the left hip, push with extension of the left hip. And then now we're going to push down. So we're going to reverse everything we just did. I have a hip extension, lower abs on the left, upper abs on the left here. Now I reverse that, so I have hip extension on the right, lower abs on the right, and upper abs on the right. So I'm turning to the left with the upper abs, right with the lower abs, and hip extension. So that is the push back and down. And then we reverse again when we push forward. left side going forward from the upper waist, left side tucking from the lower waist, left hip pushing. That creates all 8 of the Tai Chi energies. Now that we've explored hip power and its relationship to waist rotation, I'm going to take us through Grasp the Sparrow's Tail all the way to the end of the first cross hands.